and welcome. On behalf of Unite LA, my name is David Rattray. I'm the president and executive and CEO of Unite LA. And we have what we think is a really exciting reveal today. This is research that we commissioned with the generosity of the LA Partnership for Early Childhood Investment. Thank you to the partnership. Over a year ago, and we went to one of the leading economists in the region in the country and asked his firm to do what we think will be really landmark research. So today we'll have this research presented to you for the first time. This is the first time this research has gone public. So I hope you're excited about seeing it. So I'll introduce in just a minute Christopher Thornberg, and he will be presenting that to you. And then another colleague that is a great leader in early care and childhood is going to join us a little bit later. Her name is Tonia McMillian. So let me just set the topic up, and then I'll introduce Christopher to you. As we were entering 2 years ago, really, we were thinking about, so many of you know well, the research is so well established on the benefits of high quality early care and education for children. The developmental benefits, the brain development benefits. Some of you know the Heckman research that showed enormous long-term paybacks to investing adequately and significantly in the earliest years of life, starting with infants and toddlers and into preschool. What we thought would be exciting is to understand, if you paid these individuals that take care of our infants and toddlers and preschoolers at a professional level, which we know is indicated by the research from a quality point of view, what will it do for the overall economic benefit to that economy? Because you'll be injecting so much higher wages and compensation and benefits into the economy. And so that was the question we were trying to answer, which is, we think, additive to the underlying argument that this is already the right thing to do because it's good for kids. So that's when we approached our guest that I'm about ready to introduce and said, can you help us understand, if we paid these professionals as we should, what is the economic benefit to doing that? And I'll just end as I transition to you, Christopher. Of course, in this moment, the crisis is even greater, and the problem is even greater, the urgency. So obviously, as we're thinking about rebuilding our childcare system that's been decimated by COVID, we know now more than ever that supporting this sector is crucial. It's crucial to the way our economy can function. It's crucial to the well-being of our parents and our families, and especially those that are from lower incomes and in families of color. So with that, I'm going to introduce our guest to take you through this new research that we're revealing today for the first time. Many of you know, but this individual is a very esteemed economist. Christopher Thornberg founded Beacon Economics in 2006. And under his leadership, it's become one of the most respected research organizations in California, serving both public and private sector clients. Christopher was a leading economist in many different fields, but he originally was at the Anderson School at UCLA. It's when I first got to meet Christopher, and we all would look to him to say, what is happening in the economy and what will the future look like? And he became the go-to person for so many of us to tell us what to expect. So with that, we welcome you, Christopher, and thank you so much for agreeing to do the research for Unite LA and the Partnership for Early Childhood Investment. And thank you now for presenting it to us. Take it away, Christopher.
Thank you so much, David. I appreciate that. Let me go ahead and get my my slides up here. Good afternoon, everybody. I was about to say good morning, but I think we're a little past that at this point in time. Thank you for being here. I will tell you that I've, as David had noted, we've known each other for well over a decade. I've watched him and the work he's done at Unite LA, always with admiration. I was excited actually about a year and a half ago when he approached us with this particular topic. We found it fascinating, and we're thrilled to have an opportunity to work with him and his folks. And so this is kind of the net result of that. Basically, what we're going to be talking about today are the economic benefits of a professional early care and education workforce. And I call it, what do we call it, really a win-win-win scenario. This is a little different aspect of this. We've always known there's a bit of a win-win when it comes to early childhood education, but we're going the next step and saying there's a third leg of this story that needs to be told. And that's really what this report is all about. And I believe David's going to let you all know how both you can get access to these slides as well as to that report at the back end of this particular talk. So let's dive right in. Here we are in January 2021, and needless to say, it almost seems trite to be talking about something like ECE in the midst of the chaos we've seen over the last 12 months. But I would like to point out that we really have, in many ways, moved past this incredibly difficult period in the US. We have vaccine rollouts, which are almost surely going to end this pandemic by the middle part of this particular year. The economy is actually rebounding remarkably well relative to some of those incredibly dismal predictions you may have heard at the beginning of this thing. And of course, we've also made it through a relatively contentious election. With all that in mind, it is yet again time to refocus on the long run, whether we're talking about climate change, issues of inequality, labor force development, infrastructure investments, so on and so forth. This is the time to re-engage what I would call the long run challenges that we face here in the United States. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on the question of inequality. We know inequality has been a problem. It's been an increasing problem over the past bunch of decades. On the right-hand side, it's probably a picture you've all seen maybe too many times, talking about the enormous gap that has occurred between the highest and lowest income folks in our society today. And of course, when you talk about income inequality, now, as opposed to just talking about that income gap, we have to, of course, discuss the issue of poverty. Those who are really stuck at the lowest bracket of income in our nation, those families who really struggle just to keep above water. Issues, of course, have really come to a forefront over the past 12 months because we know that in these kind of business cycles, those at the bottom of the income pyramid often suffer the worst and have the slowest pace of recovery. On the left-hand side here is an estimate of poverty rates. And there's the base poverty rate, that's the OPM as they call it, that's that bottom line there. And that has stayed sort of stubbornly between 10 and 15% over the course of the years. Now, we have to, of course, modify this just a bit because looking at just gross income doesn't give us a complete picture. Really, when you want to start thinking about poverty, the issues of poverty, you have to take a couple of things else into account. One is, of course, adding the benefits that impoverished folks get, housing subsidies, SNAP, school lunch programs, so on and so forth. But also, of course, the basic expenses these households have to meet, including child support, out-of-pocket medical expenses, housing, and so on and so forth. If we include these additional benefits, it does look a modestly different picture. Poverty rates with these factored in have come down. But it's worth noting when we factor these in, California quickly goes from being mid-level in terms of poverty to being one of the worst places for poverty in the entire United States, largely driven, of course, by the incredibly high cost of housing. Now, the causes of poverty have been well discussed, a lack of education. Obviously, you think about the historic issues, particularly in inner cities, shifts in family structure. We know single moms are far more likely to be in poverty than any other group. Obviously, you think about the economic shifts with really what we call kind of the reduction of those sort of low-skilled manufacturing jobs that had over the years provided a very good standard of living for a lot of folks. And of course, the issues of race or gender discrimination that have really come to the forefront over the last couple of years between the BLM movements and of course the Me Too movement, issues we're all well aware of. But what's, of course, when you start thinking about these causes, the other thing to think about is why have we had such little success over the past bunch of years? And there was a great commentary that came out in 2019 out of the called "What's Missing in the War on Poverty," and they make a really distinct point. I mean, look, you think of the baseline poverty level that's been basically the same over the course of the last 40 or 50 years. Even the OPM shows only a limited, of course, sort of approach to controlling poverty. But then you go to the next step and you realize the government has spent over $23 trillion in trying to combat this over the last 50 years. So a phenomenal investment in resources with what looks like what I would call fairly small success. Now, of course, the new approach, the approach that David and folks in early child care are approaching is the idea of taking a step back and recognizing that to date, most of the efforts to deal with poverty have been ex post. That is to say, they are dealing with poverty after that family has already fallen into poverty. And the new approach, the new way of thinking about this is to avoid having families in poverty in the first place, an ex ante approach. And of course, when it comes to that, there's a well-established literature out there talking about the amazing benefits of early childhood education. Obviously, there are tremendous benefits for the children themselves in terms of better long-run educational outcomes, fewer social problems, whether we're talking about a criminal record or addiction, more stable employment and more stable families themselves in the long run. Obviously, enormous benefits. By the way, these are all wonderfully laid out in a report that came out not too long ago from Brookings on the impact of early childhood programs. And I have one of their conclusions on the right-hand side. It's not just the benefits for the kids, there's also the benefits for the families. Because if your kids are basically have early childhood education, that provides better ability for that family to themselves succeed, either by being able to have two parents in the workforce, bringing income into the family. And of course, it reduces the cost of childcare directly for that family, which can be such a burden, particularly for low-income households. When you look through all this information, the estimates of the returns on investments in early childhood education are clear. They range anywhere from 3-to-1 at the low end to 17-to-1 at the high end, depending on the different types of things you include in that particular calculation. In other words, this is a fantastic way of combating a long-run problem for the U.S. economy, and it has enormous overall returns. Well, to that two legs of this conversation, that is to say it's good for the kid and it's good for those families, I also want to talk about how it's good for the local economy. Look, when you think about the barriers to early childhood education, there's really two parts to that situation. The first, of course, is getting the public funding to get these centers up and running. We understand this is largely going to be a public effort to get early childhood education up and running. Really good news, this last budget round, of course, Governor Newsom did put some money aside to really study this issue in earnest. That's a good sign that there's momentum for getting that funding going. But there's another conversation to be had as well, which is about the workforce. And, you know, in context of our report, what we really did was we laid out a number of different things. And you can see the report, the cover of the report here on the right-hand side. What we talked about is not just what formalizing, professionalizing this workforce would be, but we also go about trying to actually do a census of what does the child care industry look like right now, particularly here in Los Angeles County. And there's a couple of things we immediately came up with. First of all, if you're going to have a successful early childhood education system in Los Angeles County, you're going to need almost 70,000 workers to help those 440,000 kids that are in that age range that are going to need this kind of support. Now, to put this in context, right now, well, not right now, this is 2021. Our most recent data for this particular report was from 2018. And in 2018, there were 34,000 workers, mostly fairly low paid in this particular industry. And that number, by the way, has been shrinking, despite the fact that the needs for childcare are becoming more and more acute over time. The number of people in this industry has been falling. It's also worth noting that people in this industry are mainly women, and they're mainly women that come from, of course, those Black and brown communities. And a lot of them, of course, were born overseas. And a large share of those workers by themselves are also in low-income households. In other words, today, our early childhood education system relies on low-paid, low-skilled workers who themselves are, of course, part of that poverty picture that really is at the core of what we're talking about today. So with that in mind, the idea here, of course, is how do we work with the existing system to build this early child care system? The idea here, of course, is about professionalizing the workforce. That is the creation of standards, creating the training programs that both to bring in new workers as well as to get this existing workforce if you will, into this critical field. And both of those, of course, ultimately work to try and solve this labor shortage that exists in this particular industry right now. Now, again, going back to the idea, by the way, I should point out that this data comes from the American Consumer Survey. And when we went through this data and talked about who's in this field, really we came up with four major occupations. There could be teaching assistants and child daycare services, education and child care admins and various child daycare services, preschool teachers and child daycare services, and of course, child care workers in private households. You can see a little bit of the breakdown on the left-hand side as of 2018. Overall, the majority of this industry are these child care workers. About 10,000 are in preschool, and about 3,000 are either teacher assistants or administrators in the system. So only about, if you will, 34,000 overall people in this particular sector. And as noted, it has been shrinking over time, both in terms of the labor force and, of course, thinking about the actual number of establishments. You can see in 2019, the number of establishments was down to just about 7,300, the lowest we've seen really over since, well, in almost 2 decades in terms of those institutes. And it's worth noting, this was in 2019. Of course, 2020 has been an incredibly rough year. We're not even clear what this industry is going to look like when the data starts coming out over the course of 2021. Anecdotally, there's been the closure of many of these places, which means the child care system itself, which was already very fragile, very, if you will, just not, just a sector that has never been, it's always been so informal that it's very brittle. And we know that this big hit to the economy over the course of the last 12 months has certainly played a role in diminishing these resources available. Pandemic is almost assuredly going to look significantly worse post-pandemic. So something we all need to be thinking about. Now, getting to this idea about the estimated supply gap, this is one of the main conversations we had within this particular report, talking about how many people we're going to need to service both kids in the 2 to 5 range as well as in the 0 to 2 range, because early childcare really goes to just a few months after birth, as the case may be. Different sense of needs at different levels of establishment, using what I would call basic support ratios. What we started to realize is just how severe the overall issue is. Right now, we only have about 55% of the necessary workforce for kids 2 to 5, only 11% in that under 2 range. So you see already we need a tremendous infusion of people into this particular sector. Remember, an occupation which is seeing diminished interest over time, largely, of course, because it is a sector that doesn't offer what either good pay, good benefits, or really any kind of long-run career path. And again, as already noted, a large share of this field is made up of females, and a large share of those are made up of immigrants as well as minority populations. So these are at-risk groups all by themselves. A little bit more of the basic breakdown here, data talking about the wages earned in this particular sector. For teaching assistants in this particular sector in 2018, the annual income was less than $15,000. Child care workers were earning about $20,000, $28,000 even for preschool teachers. We understand that the median price of a house in Los Angeles County is above $700,000. Rents, of course, are an enormous burden. And as you can see, that these are the kind of wages that really almost assuredly leave you in a very difficult financial position. It's not a big surprise that there's a lack of workers here. After all, anybody who has an opportunity to get education is not going to be looking at this particular field for a career. It just doesn't pay off from a long-run perspective. Now, when you start thinking about what do we do about this? Well, we first have to acknowledge, again, that the system as it exists right now has grown organically. And it's very fragile, it's very brittle, it's very ad hoc. Yes, they have some regulations and rules kind of running the system, but you could see just how brittle it was over the course of the last year, just how rough the situation is. And again, when you think about someone who gets into childcare, you start to recognize immediately that there's almost no long-run career path for them. Best case scenario, you use your childhood experience to eventually get a bachelor's degree, which might get you into the public education system, but why go that route at all, right? We might as well just go straight to teaching school at, a place like Cal State Northridge and go right into the public education system. Do not bother with ECE. So ECE in its current existent form, in many ways, relies on folks who don't have opportunities that more traditional younger workers have in our particular environment today. So the policy needs really, I would say, kind of fall into three major buckets. The first thing we need to do is formalize the childcare sector. You got to create public funding streams to support this system. This is something the governor's talking about. He's studying right now. He's putting some money to one side. And we got to be very careful here. From my perspective, you don't want the public education system to just come in and make their own system here. That's going to create a huge increase in expenses. It's going to make it a much longer runway. It's much better to focus on working with the sectors that are with the centers, with the child care professionals who are already in the field, who are out there today, who are working with these kids, who have experience and already have that system built into place. You also want to avoid creating what I would call competition between the public sector and these private firms out there, because that can actually take, remember, the people who are in this field right now are already at risk. If you hit them with, of course, competition from public education, you are very likely going to make their economic circumstances that much worse. And of course, in a very real way, while you may help long run inequality, you're going to intensify it in the short run. That means, of course, you also need to create occupational pathways for the existing childcare workforce as it is. You want to invest in training programs, particularly at community colleges. You want to build the certifications and the degrees needed for early childhood education. And of course, you want to assist the existing childcare workers in program placement. We have to help them get into these programs to get the certifications, to get the degrees, so they can take advantage of this new formalized sector. And then last but not least, you have to increase pay at these centers for these qualified workers. At the end of the document, you'll see a few little case studies. And it's interesting how if you don't take on all three of these major policy oversights, you can actually end up making the situation worse rather than better. So I do encourage you to read all the way through the report, take a look at those case studies at the end, because it gets down to a lot of this particular issue. In terms of increasing pay at these centers, one of the experiences, one case study we a more formal education training system, but they didn't bother to help the child care centers that currently exist pay the requisite wages for these workers. And what ended up happening is most of those folks basically went right into public education and ultimately made the child care shortage that much more acute. So you need to handle all three of these to avoid any of the major pitfalls. So what we did was we imagined a world by which you invested in these things. You funded these centers, you created these occupational pathways, you helped the people currently in the care system get those certifications and increase their own personal income. Now we asked, what happens when you take these folks who, remember, are making a little over $20,000 a year, you professionalize them, and of course, what you end up doing is you increase their incomes, you increase the quality of the care they provide the kids, and ultimately, yes, you get the benefit in the long run perspective of helping these kids succeed in life, helping their parents work and do better themselves. But you also get the third benefit of taking an at-risk group of people and giving them an occupational pathway that they haven't had an opportunity to be part of before. You can lift them in ways that we haven't and that we need to if we want to combat inequality right now, as well as, of course, in the long run. And I'll let you go through the various numbers we have here. I'm going to touch on a few of the high points as we get through this. But let's give you the top level. We imagine three different scenarios where we help these workers get their sort of incomes up to, on average, about $54,000 at the low end, up to, in the best case scenario, something on the order of $78,000. Now, I appreciate there's going to be some significant financial funding coming in. But remember, the government can in turn benefit if these workers in turn add, if you will, to expanding the overall pie. In fact, when you sit down and you run these multiplier effects, you realize that when they have increased income, what it really means is reduced need for public benefits. You have them spending more money, not only within the economy overall, but particularly within the neighborhoods they live in, which tend to be lower income. And you start to realize that the lift is pretty tremendous. For example, you're talking about adding something on the order of 33,000 jobs within this professional framework, which in turn, with the multiplier effects, creates over 47,000 jobs within the county. If you look at direct additional payments of somewhere in the order of about 2.7 billion, it gives back overall economic activity somewhere in the 5.2 million range. So in a very real sense, it pays for itself by adding to the overall economy. Win, win, win. You help the local economy, you help the kids, you help the families, and you help, of course, reduce inequality right here in Los Angeles County itself. Now, again, there's a lot of information, and I want you to do is I want you to download a copy of that report, take a look through it. We think it's really interesting. It brings up a lot of different aspects. It raises a bunch of new questions, which I think also need to be thought about and answered. Most importantly, of course, is I want you to take a look at the methodology. We lay it all out in the end. And the important thing here is that you could take that methodology and easily apply it to any place you wanted to look at. You could think about the lift and how it exists in various sorts of places. And of course, one nice part about this methodology, it also gives you an ability to look at the childcare system as it currently exists, which is really important for this part of the conversation. How at stress is it? How much is that part of the local inequality issues that we are currently dealing with? So, wrapping it all up, a new approach needed for the war on poverty, early childhood education, front and center, shown to have the biggest, of course, impact. But at the same time, it also addresses a critical need within local economies. Like if issues with childcare, the need for a solid, healthy childcare sector has ever, we all know it's important, but we just realized just how important it is more than ever over the last 12 months. And remember, the issues in this sector are becoming more acute over time. After all, in this world where you need those degrees, diplomas to get ahead in life, moving into the early childhood sector, it simply doesn't offer an occupational pathway. It not only will not attract, if you will, the workers, the long-run workers of tomorrow, but obviously at this point in time, the folks who do work in there are folks who have limited overall career paths and often are in the midst of poverty themselves. We need to create those standards. We got to train this workforce. And of course, ultimately, when we do all this, it helps this existing workforce by giving them occupational pathways, which we know is the long run key to helping them get ahead in life. And ultimately, yes, there's a lot of public costs here. One of the big issues is how are we going to find the funding streams for this? And the answer, of course, is to recognize that here, the kind of public funding streams we're talking about have a very specific payoff. Increased economic activity, reduced need for public services, reduced inequality, investing in low-income neighborhoods, and of course, ultimately expanding labor force participation by creating a new pathway for people who may not have had opportunities given their own skill sets in the past, but also by expanding labor force participation for those families who can have their kids in these particular centers, allowing them to go out and work at all. It's a win-win-win scenario, folks. And we really need to redouble our efforts to get this thing off the ground. For too long, ECE has been what I would call a kind of pie in the sky, long run ideal. It's time for us to make this a short run reality. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up and turn it back over to David and the rest of the crew here.
Thank you, Christopher. And Christopher's going to stay with us to address questions. I've seen a handful already posted in the chat. But now I'm going to move to Tonia McMillian. And I'll briefly introduce Tonia. Some of you know her. She's been a professional in the child care provider system and world for 24 years. She served with our colleague, Sonia Campos Rivera, on Speaker Rendon's Blue Ribbon Commission, and also was served on behalf of the Governor of California, Governor Newsom, on the Early Childhood Master Plan Working Group. She's done work in this field over her whole career and has firsthand experienced some of the challenges that Christopher has revealed at a macro level. And she's also a leader in SEIU and very much a part as a union steward in the work to organize this sector. So please welcome everyone, Tonia. If we're in the room together, Tonia, we have almost 100 people that would be clapping right now. So first of all, Tonia, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to ask you a series of questions, but I first want to just let you say hello to the group and if you want to open up with any reactions to what you just heard from Christopher.
Okay, thank you, David. I'm really excited about this opportunity. And oh my God, Christopher, thank you for highlighting some of the information that many of us already know who work in this field, but seeing it on paper, it just really drives the point home how much we really need to address the needs in this workforce. And I'm so proud to have an opportunity to shed just a little bit more light on what it's like working in this field.
Well, so go right to that, Tonia. I mean, we talked about the sort of challenges that so many providers have and individual caretakers. Um, and maybe start a little bit with now there's an opportunity to organize this workforce, and we know you're a big part of that. So reflect on that a little bit. What are the challenges, and what will that help? What will that do to help this?
Well, first, I'd like to say congratulations to the family child care providers and for us winning the right to organize and have a seat at the table. And I know that my local Child Care Providers United has put together a bargaining team and a negotiations team, and they're working really hard on behalf of us. But I spent 12 and a half years on the front line, sacrificing time away from my child care, going back and forth to Sacramento, educating our legislators about the reality of working in this field and the lack of support, the lack of resources, the stereotypes, just really making sure folks understood what we bring to the table. And what I found out was there have been just too many occasions where decisions have been made for the family child care workforce, and the workforce had no voice in those decisions. And that was probably the biggest reason why we needed to have a right to organize. We bring the truth to the story, and we bring the facts to the story, so that whatever statutes come out of it, whatever policies come out, we'd like for them to truly align with the work that's being done out in the field. And so I'm super proud of the time that I put forth, along with 40,000 other women across the state, and making this happen.
Thank you, Tonia, and congratulations again on that huge victory. So, as you saw Christopher present, we started with this assumption that we've all know that are in the field that we need to pay people in the field as professionals at this much higher level. But at the same time, as you know, there's always a raging debate too about, does that mean that everybody's required to have a bachelor's degree? What's the pathway? How do we support the field as it is today for you and so many of your colleagues, so that as we actually try to do the right thing by you, we don't actually dislocate you from the very field? And so you saw Christopher talk a little bit about investing in pathways and making sure we support the existing workforce if we're going to go to that imagined better place. Love to have you just comment on that a little bit. How important is that? What does that mean? And is that doable? What's this going to take?
Thank you, David. So that was one of the things that I brought up as a member of Speaker Rendon's the Blue Ribbon Commission. I really wanted to point out the fact that you can come into this field, and now I'm speaking specifically about family child care. You can come into this field with a high school diploma or a master's degree, and we both make the same money. There's no recognition for expanding your education. There's no, of course, no compensation to go along with what you have worked so diligently for, I put off doing further study. Once I realized, my God, if I do all of this and I incur even more school debt, loan debt, that just doesn't make sense. That doesn't equate. And so if there's no incentive put in place, and I guarantee you, there are so many providers out there who really want to expand their education, who really want to gain more skills. When you put that along with the experience of doing this work together, you do raise the quality, but you've got to create a pathway and include an incentive that will give folks some type of hope that they can actually attain this.
Thank you, Tonia. So now you saw in the research that Beacon presented that often because we pay at such low levels, so many of these individuals have no choice but to try to seek some social programs and other income supports and benefits. And that if we paid at the professional level, that would be a savings to government. There'd be an offset to that. Can you just relate to that a little bit? Do you find that for yourself or for others that in the field that you can personalize a little bit for us?
Definitely. It's I call family child care providers superheroes, financial superheroes, because just based on the fact that we the regional market rate that we are paid under is, oh God, so it shows apparent inequity, inequality. It blatantly shows the systemic racism, the systemic sexism that exists by the way that we are paid. I call us superheroes because somehow we manage. Somehow we have figured out a way to not only meet the needs of the parents that we serve and the children that we serve, but we also have to figure out a way to take care of our own families. And it is really sad when you see a family child care provider who has to go to a food bank to feed her own children. That is an embarrassment, if you ask me. And especially in a state like California, we have billionaires here. Everybody wants the best for their children. As a parent, I've always wanted the best for my sons when I had them. I don't know one parent who has a child, and when it comes to their child care, they say, oh, let me find the cheapest child care I can find. Let me find the lowest quality that's offered that I can find. We feel the same way. And so just the mere fact that, yes, grateful for having the social services that are available, but early educators should not be forced to have to take away or be in line with the parents. We're both in line together. There's something wrong with that picture. You see my grandson.
My grandson's in the other room at this moment. Thank you. Of course, Tonia, I mean, that just reminds me of the old adage, like, who takes care of the caretakers? And clearly we're not honoring that. So one last thing, and again, I'll invite you if you want to make any sort of other comments about the research, Tonia, and then we'll go to questions. So you saw in this research, we're really trying to emphasize the ripple effects, that if childcare workers and early education workers were paid at this much higher level, that they would invest that money they'd spend that money in the economy, and it would create a multiplier effect of 1.9 What's your reaction to that? Does that make sense to you? It could, is that logical from your personal experience?
It most definitely makes sense. And let me say this, child care providers would spend more money because we already spend money in our local cities. Like we definitely play a major role in the economy. Um, Most of the, pretty much the majority of the money that I make, it comes right back here into my child care. But I buy my food at my local grocery store. I buy my gas at my local gas station. I spend so much in my own city. So yeah, we would spend more than we're already spending in in our cities and in our state.
Great. Thank you, Tonia. So if you can hang with us now, we're going to bring Christopher back on. And I'm going to pull some of the questions that have come up in the chat for both of you. So has Christopher rejoined us?
I'm here.
Yeah.
Hi,
Hi, Christopher.
Hi, Tonia. Nice to chat with you. I got booted there temporarily.
Okay, so Christopher, just one clarifying question we had is the workforce that number that you talked about getting to 70,000,
Yeah.
that was the full birth to 5, right? It wasn't just 0 to 3 or preschool.
Right. Yeah. That's yeah. We use some
Okay.
basic support ratios from some of the industry standards, and we applied that to the population here in LA County of the under 5 and under.
So another question came up that it looks like there, I think the assumption looked like is you were using full-time workers to use all these numbers. And some of these are part-time workers. Would that make it look less bad? Was I think the question. Is it more favorable if the part-time workers were shown as full-time?
Well, I mean, I think one of the reasons that the incomes are so low in this area is because a lot of these jobs are in fact part-time. I think that's the point here. Obviously, part of the increase in salary would be about moving these folks to a more full-time status, right? So that is part of the lift, as the case may be. Yeah.
Can I ask Christopher a question, David?
Please, Tonia. Absolutely.
And so, yeah, when you speak of part-time and full-time, so what does the data show? Because the average family child care worker provider works a minimum of 12 hours per day. So what does the data show as far as that workforce?
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, to your point, right? One of the things we're really missing here is what I would call the informal childcare force. That is to say, grandmas, cousins, aunts, uncles, folks who may be doing this kind of work because the family doesn't have the resources to actually pay for a more formal system, as the case may be. The data we have is being pulled, of course, directly from the actual more formal employment sector. We have to appreciate there's an enormous informal workforce out there. Could be something even as simple as just a neighborhood group getting together and kind of watching each other's kids. Again, we're not even discussing that because in a lot of cases, those are unpaid positions, right? These are people spending very real time helping each other. And we're talking about, again, moving that to a far more professional standpoint.
But I'm speaking of, and I know you're talking about family, friend, and neighbor, but I'm speaking of somebody like myself, who is a licensed child care provider, who has a degree, who does this work full time. Is there, okay. So yeah, I'd just like to hear a little bit more about the data on where we fit in and what category does that fall under?
Well, I mean, obviously, some of the folks here are full-time, such as yourself. I mean, a lot of it's going to depend on how you end up in the data. One of the things I would argue is that one of the things that this report immediately lets us realize is that we don't have a very good grasp on the space of the industry, right? Mm-hmm. We have the American Community Survey, which is an invaluable asset, but it's only 3% population sample, and we got to make a lot of, shall we say, draw a lot of conclusions, and it doesn't give us a full grasp on that. And as already noted, we have really good metrics on the informal part of this sector. Again, what we're really referring to here is, I think, is the idea that one of the steps in the process here, a necessary step in the process, is better identifying what is happening right now, right? To make these issues more apparent to policymakers, right? Because right now we don't really talk about it. No, it's just there. We know it's under stress, but no one ever sits down and creates the census, creates the trends. One of the things I didn't talk about, for example, there's a big graying in the industry as well. You don't see young folks getting into the industry. There's a big
Right.
decline in the under 45 component of this workforce. You think about millennials, they don't look at this as a viable career path, and they
Right.
should. We want them to. Look, the next generations are going to have the more educational opportunities than any previous generation has had, right? And we want these kids to look at early childhood education as something that is valuable to invest in, not something you do because you don't have any other options, which is kind of where it almost looks like right now, right? And we
Okay, I have a
need
couple
to,
other
yeah. Oh,
a
sorry,
couple
David.
other questions.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So a question, given that most of the low wages in the field come from the private market,
Yeah.
Parentheses, parents paying for childcare.
Yeah.
What are the non-subsidy, non-public rate increase solutions to the overall raise in wages for the field? Now, I'll just say one thing. I mean, we didn't ask Christopher to look at this. He knows this issue. One big possible solution is a refundable tax credit, which is part of what President Biden has actually proposed. For those who don't know what a refundable tax credit is, it's a tax credit that comes to you even if you do not have income taxes owed. So regardless of your income level, you're assured some form of a credit. That's one way to give parents an offset if the cost of childcare in preschool goes up to pay better wages. You can have a significant childcare tax credit increase and make it refundable. But Christopher, you want to add anything to that?
Well, I mean, to your point, David, there's numerous mechanisms, right? One mechanism, to your point, is allow the parent to make the educational choice. What ECE do I want to invest in? And as an economist, I'll tell you I like that, because what we really want is we want to have competition side by side with the increase in quality standards. We don't want to go for higher quality standards and then diminish incentives to create the best, if you will, type of ECE educational institution. So to your point, that tax credit is a great way of doing it. Obviously, there can also be direct funding of these centers, as the case may be. If they go to, say, the city or the county and say, hey, we have met these standards, the people I'm hiring have these diplomas, then you could have, of course, a direct funding as well to cover some of the expenses. So there's multiple ways of going about doing it. But again, the first thing you have to do is you got to build these standards. You got to create these systems, and then you have to get the workforce ready to meet those challenges.
Thank you, Christopher. So another question I have is, I work for the city that provides licensed childcare programs. I support the Beacon Economics recommendation 100%. However, our participant fees are set to cover direct salary and operational costs of the program, and parents are already stretched to pay tuition. Is it possible the state of California would provide funding to cover? Okay, it's a similar question. I mean, basically,
sort of question, right?
we're not trying to actually talk about how to best do it. We're trying to explain the benefits of doing it to the overall economic expansion. But underneath that, then we have to figure out how we do it. And Christopher did put forth some recommendations. And of course, Tonia did in her work with the Blue Ribbon Commission. I just want to reinforce with all of you, these are really great questions, by the way. A lot of you are already advocates with us. And so we know you're the choir. We're trying to add to your arguments even more evidence. So that's the thing I would think about is think about this as an additional layer of evidence that adds to everything you already use to advocate why we should better fund publicly birth to 5. So I just want to reframe that. That's really the main point here.
Yeah, but David, I also want to go the next step, because again, I want to go back to pointing out a couple of those very short but interesting case studies we remark about at the end of this in the 5th chapter, which go through a couple of the pitfalls. That's what I said, that when you're thinking about this, for example, just simply having, say, public education expand their reach at some level, can create more local problems, right? You can actually end up displacing more people. What you want to do is, again, use the benefit of the existing system, of the people who are in the system, who've shown how much they care about kids, that they're willing to be there. And you want to make them part of the solution rather than freezing them out and creating, if you will, some sort of making them even more second tier relative to a formal system. It's a great way, again, of combating some of the local inequalities that we're facing here in LA County that we're also cognizant of.
Okay, so the next question I have for you, Tonia, in what ways would it benefit family childcare providers to help them move from rented locations to homes that they own? So I guess that's a question about if we actually provided home ownership supports for the
Mm,
childcare sector, what would be the benefit of that?
that's a good question. I know that there are, well, I was a homeowner, and then when the market crashed, I lost my home. So now I'm a renter. The benefit of owning your home, you could really design it, your childcare facility, the way that you want to design it without having to ask for permission. Um, and the tax write-off would be amazing, of course. Um, and we have so many billionaires in this state of California. Maybe some private um, funds that would lend a hand to making that possible. That's a good question.
So let's hold that. I mean, I think it's a good recommendation. We're talking about many different things that try to get the cost of housing down. So
Yeah.
Christopher, do you want to take a whack at that too?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's lots of permutations of this. It certainly rolling this kind of conversation to me could be of interest, but it's not something we directly studied. So I'm a little hesitant
Okay.
shooting from the
Um,
hip on this particular one, as the case may be. So yeah.
I will say it doesn't address the question asked by our participant, but within the proposal from the governor and from the president, there is proposals to fund infrastructure, including infrastructure of childcare facilities. Now that would be aimed at the formal sector, childcare centers, and I know the question was a broader question or more targeted to home care. So that might be a good policy challenge too. Is let's make sure that if we do an infrastructure investment, we don't forget about the informal sector that also needs supports. Um, okay, another question. It's similar to the question, some of the work you've already described, Christopher, but another whack at it. Right now, young people should not see ECE as a viable career path. As the report documents, young people are making rational choices away from ECE. We're sunk if we don't fix that. I mean, I think that's more or less what you were trying to say in your own words. I don't know if you want to restate it in any
Well,
different
again,
way.
it's exactly right. Right. I mean, look, we want, you want people to look at this as an opportunity for a life, right? As a career life choice. It's not what it is right now, right? I mean, the people who are in this field, for the most part, are in the field because they haven't had other options, right? And that's, again, we have this problem. We know there's a group of people out there who don't have opportunities that many others do. We want to help them with those opportunities. This is the way to both lift them as well as lift these families who need better early childhood education for their kids. So from my point, again, you want to engage in the existing workforce rather than create just a brand new one, as the case may be. But with that in mind, we also have to acknowledge that the way the system is operating right now has left a critical shortage. So yeah, you want to help those people who are there, but let's recognize that even if you got every one of the people already in early childhood education, you got them those certifications, you got them the diplomas, you still are short 30,000 people, right? So 30,000 plus. So yeah, you have to do both. You have to encourage new workers as well as, of course, helping the existing workers. And you know what was interesting. One of the little case studies we came up with. Again, I love case studies. For me, right? It's always a great way of talking about the pitfalls and perils of particular policy choices. There was one place where they did work very hard to take current ECU workers and get them certifications and diplomas, but they didn't go the next step in order to make sure that they could get proper pay within the system. And what did these people do? Well, guess what? They went to the public education system and started teaching kindergarten, first, second grade, where they could make good money. And that actually made the childcare shortage worse, as the case may be. So you gotta help the actual system, the people who are running these centers, as well as helping the people who are going to work at those centers. You gotta have this multi-prong approach. You can't take one corner of it and think you're going to fix it. You have to work on all three parts of it.
And if I can add, part of that fix would also help retain qualified, amazing workers in this field, because retention is not so good either. So
Yeah. So retention would just be another benefit to this, recruitment, retention, and the delivery of services themselves. So with that, I want to thank again Tonia for being with us today. In your granddaughter?
Grandson.
Your grandson? What's his
Yeah.
name, Tonia?
His name is Amari.
Hi, Amari.
Say hi.
And so wonderful to have you with us. Thank you, Christopher. I want to thank the Early Childhood Investment, the Partnership for Early Childhood Investment for underwriting this work, and all my colleagues. We will send you a link with the final report. You'll get a 2-pager. There will be a really tight summary of these findings, and then you'll see a full report. And as far as next steps, I would ask you to be part of the next steps. The next steps is be a champion of this. It adds to so many of you are already amazing advocates. Work this into your advocacy so you have one more argument to make about why we should invest the additional resources to bring access to quality care and support our heroes like Tonia. So that's the next steps. We will do our best with all of our partners to bring this exciting new research to the field. And as Christopher said, for those of you that are throughout the state and other places, Christopher has made sure the methodology in the back will show you how you could apply this research to any county, the whole state, or other places. So with that, we'll sign off. God bless you all. Everybody, please stay healthy.